A few notes before I tell you the story of Jonah. So, Jonah was a prophet from the northern kingdom. He shows up in the book of Kings really briefly, and then we get this story about Jonah that's the book of Jonah. And this is a story that was told later on after the northern kingdom, where Jonah was from, had disappeared. It was taken over by the Assyrians. Their capital was Nineveh, and they were pretty brutal. They dispersed the people of Israel all throughout their kingdom, and they were no more. So this story is about Jonah during the time when Assyria is in power, and he's told to go there. One other note about the story: at a point in the story, the sailors cast lots. Basically, they were flipping a coin to see what God was doing. So that's what they mean when they're casting lots. They're trying to figure out whose fault it is that there's a big storm. So, a story about Jonah. Once, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah set out and went to Tarshish to flee from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, found a boat going to Tarshish, paid his fare, got on, and went with them to Tarshish to flee from the presence of the Lord. But God cast a mighty wind upon the sea, so that a great storm came up, and the ship threatened to break up. Now the sailors became very afraid, and each prayed to his God. And they took the cargo of the ship and threw it overboard so that the ship might be lighter for them. Meanwhile, Jonah went down into the hold of the ship, laid down, and was fast asleep. The captain came to him and said, "What are you doing? Get up and call out to your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought and we won't perish." The sailors said to one another, "Let us cast lots to see on whose account this calamity has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. They said to him, "What have you done? What's your occupation? Where do you come from? What country are you from? Of what people are you?" Jonah replied, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." The sailors became even more afraid and said, "What is this that you have done?" For he had told them that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. And so they were even more afraid. They said to him, "What shall we do to you, that this calamity, that the sea might quiet down for us?" Jonah said, "Pick me up, throw me into the sea, for I know that it is on my account that this calamity has come upon us." Nevertheless, the sailors rowed hard to get the ship back to dry land. But the storm became even stronger and worked against them. So the sailors all prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. And do not let us be guilty of innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as you pleased." So they picked Jonah up, threw him into the sea, and the sea became as smooth as glass. And the sailors were then even more afraid of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to the Lord. Meanwhile, the Lord appointed a big fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. Then the Lord spoke to the fish and the fish spewed Jonah out onto dry land. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go now, get up, and go to Nineveh, that great city, and tell them what I tell you. So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Nineveh was a huge city, 3 days' walk across. Jonah set out into the city, went a day's walk, and then cried out, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast. And everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. When news of it reached the king of Nineveh, he rose up from his throne, removed his robe, put on sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Then he made a proclamation on all of Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd or cattle shall taste anything. They shall not feed, they shall not drink water. Human beings and animals shall put on sackcloth and cry out mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hand. Who knows? Maybe God will relent and change his mind. He might turn his fierce anger from us so that we do not perish. God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways and changed his mind about the calamity he said he would bring on them, and didn't do it. Jonah was very displeased about this. And he cried out angrily to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said when I was still in my own country? This is why I went to Tarshish in the beginning, for I knew that you are gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and ready to relent from punishing. And now take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live." The Lord said, "Is it right for you to be angry?" So Jonah went out of the city, sat down east of the city, and made himself a little shelter and sat in its shade and waited to see what would happen to the city. God appointed a bush and made it grow up over Jonah so that he could sit in its shade to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was really happy about the bush. But when dawn came, God appointed a worm, and it attacked the bush so that it withered. And when the sun rose up, the Lord prepared a sultry east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head, and he became faint and asked that he might die, saying, "It's better for me to die than to live." The Lord said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the bush?" Jonah replied, "Angry enough to die." The Lord said, "You neither labored for nor grew the bush. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. Is it not right then for me to be concerned with Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 people who don't know their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So that's the story of Jonah. The really easy sermon that I thought about giving was about how, like, now that the election's over, we shouldn't be mad at Republicans or Democrats, we should all work together and all that stuff. But you know that sermon, and you've heard that in the news all week. You don't need to hear that now. So here's something different. But keep that in mind. That's still a good sermon today. But we don't need to rehearse the details. Last night, a dog with one eye spent the night at my house. What does that have to do with Jonah or anything? Well, not much. But he's really cute. His name is Captain Grover Feisty Faced. Because he has one eye like a pirate. It's kind of awesome. But that doesn't have anything to do with our text. But neither does most of the things we do with our lives or in the name of God. Not that we waste our lives constantly, but sometimes we get so comfortable with what we've done before that we forget to listen to what God is calling us to do now. Because Jonah was used to the Lord, the God of Israel, just Israel. But then God sends them off to their enemies. And he doesn't want to go because he knows God is going to forgive them and care about them. And he doesn't want that. He just wants his own country to survive. But if you look at this story, the person that I least want to be like in it is Jonah. The people who really respond and do God's will are things like the wind, a fish, a bush, a worm. Be like the worm. Never thought I'd say that, right? And the people of Nineveh, and the sailors. And we all know how sailors talk. Be like sailors. It's not the prophet who's getting it. The zeal of these converts is amazing. They all put on sackcloth and sit on ashes and fast. These are ways of repenting and mourning, saying we're sorry for what we've done before. We get comfortable as Christians and people of God and church folk. And we do things because we've always done them that way. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not to say that we can't do the same things twice, or 3 times, or 500 times. But we need to keep asking, what is God up to? What does God want us to be doing? Is this thing we've done before, for a good reason, still meaningful? Is it still compelling? Is this where God's working? Because we knew that God worked in Israel before. We knew that God worked in a lutefisk dinner before. We know that God worked through lighting candles for All Saints Sunday before and saved us from a big pool of fire last week. If you weren't here last week, we had a big bowl of candles, and at the end of the service, we had a lake of fire, and putting it out was pretty scary and awesome. And God worked through it. But should we do that next year? Maybe, but maybe not. Because what's important isn't whether or not we light candles, whether we serve fresh lutefisk, whether or not we have Christmas morning service or not, whether we have our services, our weekly worship, on, say, Tuesday evening or Sunday morning. That's not what at the core of who we are. What's at the core of who we are is a God who's gracious and merciful, who's slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. At our core is a God who forgives us and the whole world. And in response to that, God just wants us to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with our God. And if what we're doing fits with that, we should keep doing it. If we look at what we do at church, but also every day of our lives, and it's not reflecting that, it's not furthering justice, it's not loving our neighbor, showing kindness, and it's not deepening our relationship with the Lord, maybe we don't need to be doing those things. Because there's something even richer and more fulfilling for us to do with our lives. There's something even better. Because we don't want to just spin our wheels and run away and get digested by fish and then thrown up by them. Gross! It sounds unpleasant. But in doing God's will, which will happen in spite of us. So if I can pull a piece from my sermon that I'm not giving. God will work despite us. Regardless of who got elected to which position, at a certain point, we have to trust that God is in charge and will work through them. That's not to say that we shouldn't try and live out our values and our faith in our civic life and who we elect, but God can work regardless of us. It doesn't matter who wins the last election, the next elections, whether or not the United States exists forever or not. God will work. Because God is bigger than the king of Nineveh, the president of America, the Pope, the new Archbishop of Canterbury. God is bigger. God is bigger than our imaginations and will forgive us more than we can screw it up. So maybe we're screwing everything up. Maybe we're doing everything right. But let's keep asking. And let's try and capture the faithfulness and the zeal of being a worm. Amen.